the 5 Scottish families who built the ships, steel and empire of the United Kingdom. The Napier family forged the entire Clyde shipbuilding industry. In the summer of 1838, a Canadian businessman named Samuel Cunard arrived in Glasgow with an idea and a problem. The idea was a regular steamship service between Britain and North America. The problem was that nobody in London believed it could be done reliably enough to justify the investment. Cunard had been sent north, away from the established engineering firms of the Thames, on the advice of James Melville, Secretary of the East India Company, who told him there was one man in Scotland who understood steam navigation better than anyone in the Royal Navy. That man was Robert Napier, born in Dumbarton in 1791, the son of a millwright and the grandson of engineers who had served the Duke of Argyll at Inverarray Castle. What Cunard found when he reached Glasgow was not a grand industrial establishment, but a working engineer who had spent 20 years solving problems that nobody else had thought important enough to address. Napier had built his first marine steam engine in 1823 for the paddle steamer Leven, constructed by James Lang at Dumbarton. The engine was so well designed that it outlasted the Leven itself, was transferred to 2 subsequent vessels, and was eventually presented by Napier's descendants to Dumbarton, where it can still be seen at the Scottish Maritime Museum. By the time Cunard arrived, Napier had already won a contract from the East India Company for the armed paddle sloop Berenice, beating the London engineers who had dismissed him as a mere provincial, and then watching in silence as the Berenice outperformed her Thames-built sister ship Atalanta in every measurable category. Cunard wanted 3 ships. Napier told him he needed 4 vessels of at least 1,150 tons apiece to maintain a reliable service year-round. Cunard listened. The 4 original Cunarders, Acadia, Britannia, Caledonia and Columbia, were designed under Napier's supervision and engined entirely in his Lancefield works on the Glasgow waterfront. Cunard's red and black funnel livery, carried by every Cunard ship to the present day, was Napier's own colour scheme, borrowed from the Scottish coastal steamers he had previously owned. But the deeper legacy of the Napier family was not the Cunard line itself, it was what the Napier workshops produced in human terms. By the early 1850s, Robert Napier's yards at Govan had become the most advanced school of marine engineering in the world. The men who trained under him, as apprentices, draftsmen, managers and foremen, went on to establish virtually every significant shipbuilding enterprise that would make the Clyde famous for the following century. John Elder trained under Napier before founding Fairfield. The Thompson brothers, James and George, learned their craft at Napier's yards before moving to Clydebank and creating what would eventually become John Brown and Company, the yard that built the Queen Mary. By 1864, more than 20 shipyards operated along the River Clyde. By 1870, more than half the entire British shipbuilding workforce was concentrated on the Clyde, producing half of Britain's total annual tonnage. The Napier family had not merely built ships. They had built the industry, the culture, and the institutional knowledge that made Glasgow the shipbuilding capital of the world. The Baird brothers built the world's largest ironworks alone. On the 4th of May 1830, a flame was lit at Gartsherry, a small settlement in North Lanarkshire between the towns of Coatbridge and Airdrie, that would burn, in various form, for 137 years. The men who lit it were William and James Baird, 2 of the 8 sons of Alexander Baird, a Lanarkshire farmer who had begun leasing coal rights in the Monklands area around 1816. The family's transition from farming to coal mining to iron smelting had taken less than 15 years. It would produce one of the most extraordinary industrial empires in the history of the British Isles. The Gartsherry furnace of 1830 was a single unit, modest by the standards of what would follow. What made it possible was a combination of geological luck and technological timing. The Monklands area of Lanarkshire sat above deposits of blackband ironstone, a formation discovered by David Mouchet that could be smelted efficiently using a new process patented in 1828 by James Beaumont Nielsen, the hot blast. The hot blast injected preheated air into the furnace, dramatically reducing the amount of coal required per ton of iron produced and transforming the economics of the Scottish iron industry overnight. William and James Baird moved faster than any of their competitors to exploit both the geology and the technology simultaneously. By 1835, they had multiple furnaces in operation. By 1843, Gartsherry had 16 furnaces with a combined annual capacity of 100,000 tons of pig iron, making it, without dispute, the largest single pig iron producing unit in the world. In that same year, They had also acquired control of the dominant share of the splint coal and black band ore deposits necessary to feed those furnaces. No rival could undercut them on raw materials because the Bairds already controlled the ground beneath their competitors' feet. The scale of what followed was staggering. By 1864, James Baird, who had taken over active management of the enterprise while his brother William moved into politics, had expanded to nearly 50 blast furnaces producing 300,000 tons of iron annually and employing 10,000 people directly. The Baird brothers became responsible for 25% of Scotland's entire iron output, making William Baird and Company the largest producers of pig iron in the world. Their commercial reach extended far beyond Lanarkshire. By the 1870s, they were operating mines in Cumberland in the north of England and in Spain. They held 29 railway company directorships and 5 chairmanships, a figure that gave the family structural influence over the transport infrastructure of industrial Scotland. William Baird served as Conservative Member of Parliament for Falkirk Burghs from 1841 to 1846. His brother James held the same seat from 1850 to 1857. James Baird donated £500,000 to church construction, one of the largest single philanthropic acts in Victorian Scottish history. He died unmarried and childless in 1876 at his Ayrshire estate of Cambusdoon, leaving behind no direct heirs but an industrial legacy that shaped the physical and economic landscape of central Scotland for generations. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming content about the United Kingdom and its history. Thank you for your support, and now, let's continue. The Coates family thread empire conquered every inhabited continent. In 1826, James Coates, a Paisley weaver who had spent years in the silk and canton crepe trade, used the profits of his earlier commercial career to build a small thread-twisting factory behind his home at Fergusley on the western edge of Paisley, Renfrewshire. The factory ran on a 12-horsepower engine. It occupied a modest plot. Nothing about it suggested that it would become, within 70 years, the third largest company in the world by market capitalization, behind only US Steel and Standard Oil. James Coates retired in 1830 and transferred the business to his sons, rechristening it J&P Coates after his eldest surviving sons, James Jr. and Peter. A third son, Thomas, born in 1809, joined the enterprise and became its most expansive force. Each of the 3 brothers brought a different expertise. James managed manufacturing, Peter handled merchandising, and Thomas oversaw engineering. The combination proved devastating to their competitors. The quality of Coates thread was so consistently superior that multiple companies produced inferior imitations, generating a series of legal cases that the Coates family won comprehensively, and that in each instance served only to advertise the superiority of the authentic product. By 1840, 3/4 of the company's entire trade was with the United States. A 4th brother, Andrew Coates, was dispatched to North America to manage the growing transatlantic business personally, and remained there for 20 years building the infrastructure of Coates's American operations. The Clarks of Paisley, a rival thread-making family operating from the other end of the town, were simultaneously expanding across the Atlantic. In 1864, George and William Clark opened a cotton thread mill in Newark, New Jersey. In 1869, the Coates family responded by opening a mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, operating under the name Spool Cotton Company. The competitive dynamic between the 2 Paisley families drove both to expand faster and further than either would have managed alone. By the 1880s, Coates had factories and commercial offices in the United States, China, Brazil and India. In 1890, the company's initial share offering took place on the London Stock Exchange. In 1896, the Coates and Clark firms merged to form J&P Coates Limited, with a market value of approximately £22 million, over 50,000 employees worldwide, and approximately 25,000 shareholders. The combined company was, by any reasonable definition, the first true multinational industrial corporation in history. By 1910, it had achieved a market capitalization of $300 million, placing it 3rd in the world between US Steel and Standard Oil. The physical legacy of the Coates family in Paisley remains visible today. Thomas Coates established the Coates Observatory in 1883, Scotland's oldest public observatory. The family donated Fountain Gardens, Paisley's oldest public park, to the town. The Coates Memorial Church, a landmark building on the Paisley skyline, was funded by the family in memory of Thomas Coates following his death in 1883. A town of weavers had produced one of the most powerful commercial dynasties in the history of British industry. John Elder's engine invention revolutionised global maritime trade. The problem that John Elder solved in the 1850s was one that had constrained steam-powered shipping since the day Robert Fulton first put a steam engine in a boat: fuel consumption. Early marine steam engines were profligate with coal. They burned enormous quantities to produce limited power, which meant that any ship relying on them required so much bunkered coal that cargo space was severely reduced and range was severely limited. Long-distance steam shipping could only function if coaling stations were available at frequent intervals along every route, which in practice meant that steam power was commercially viable on the North Atlantic, where ports were close but deeply problematic on longer routes to Asia, South America and the Pacific. Elder, who had trained as a marine engineer at Robert Napier's yards on the Clyde before joining Charles Randolph as a partner in his engineering works in Tradeston, Glasgow, understood the thermodynamics of the problem with exceptional precision. The compound steam engine he developed, in which steam was expanded through 2 cylinders rather than 1, extracting more work from each unit of fuel before it was exhausted, dramatically reduced the coal consumption of marine steam engines. The efficiency gains were immediate, measurable and transformative. Ships equipped with Elder's compound engine could travel significantly further on the same quantity of coal, which meant that cargo space could replace bunkerage, freight rates could fall, and routes previously uneconomical for steam shipping became commercially viable overnight. The practical consequences for British imperial trade were profound. In 1858, Elder and Randolph moved their operations to a site at Fairfield Farm on the banks of the Clyde in Govan, establishing what would become one of the greatest shipbuilding enterprises in history. By 1868, Randolph had retired and the firm operated under Elder's name alone. John Elder died in 1869, aged just 45, from the accumulated physical strain of 2 decades of intensive industrial work. His wife Isabella took temporary control of the enterprise, managing it with sufficient competence to preserve it until new partners, including Sir William Pierce, could take over. Isabella Elder subsequently purchased the Fairfield estate land in 1885 and donated it to the people of Govan as Elder Park, which remains a public green space to the present day. Under Sir William Pierce's direction from 1869 onwards, the Fairfield Shipbuilding and Engineering Company grew to employ 70,000 workers across 19 yards at its peak. The drawing offices constructed for Fairfield in 1889 to 1891 were designed by John Keppie, with assistance from a young Charles Rennie Mackintosh. The Fairfield yards built the blue rebound-winning Cunard liners RMS Campania and RMS Lucania, and during the First World War operated at full capacity producing warships for the Royal Navy. Andrew Carnegie left Dunfermline and conquered the world. Andrew Carnegie was born on the 25th of November 1835 in a one-room weaver's cottage in Moody Street, Dunfermline on Fife. His father, William Carnegie, was a handloom weaver whose trade was being systematically destroyed by the mechanisation of the textile industry. His mother, Margaret Morrison, was the decisive force in the family's decision to emigrate. In 1848, when Andrew was 12 years old, the Carnegies sailed for the United States. They settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, a working-class district across the river from Pittsburgh, where Margaret's sister had already established herself. Andrew Carnegie began his American working life as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, earning $1.20 per week. He was 13 years old. What followed across the next 5 decades is one of the most extraordinary trajectories in the history of industrial capitalism. Carnegie moved from factory work to telegraph messenger, from messenger to telegraph operator, from operator to railway executive. By 1865, age 29, he had already accumulated sufficient capital and commercial contacts to begin the transition from employee to industrialist. He invested early and decisively in iron production, then in the Bessemer steel process as it became available in the United States during the 1860s and 1870s. The Carnegie Steel Company, built around the Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, and the Homestead Works in Homestead, Pennsylvania, became the most efficient steel producer in the world by applying the cost-cutting disciplines and technological investment that Carnegie had absorbed from his years observing railway management. By the 1890s, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel annually than the entire United Kingdom. On the 25th of February 1901, Carnegie sold his steel interest to the financier John Pierpont Morgan for $480 million, the largest commercial transaction in history to that point, and sufficient to make Carnegie, briefly, the wealthiest private individual on earth. He spent the remaining 18 years of his life giving the money away. He gave approximately $350 million to charitable causes, equivalent to $6.9 billion in 2025 values, including 2,509 public libraries built across the English-speaking world. Of those, 660 were built in the United Kingdom, including dozens in Scotland. In 1898, Carnegie purchased Skibo Castle in Sutherland in the Scottish Highlands and spent his summers there for the rest of his life. He funded the Carnegie Dunfermline Trust to provide amenities for his birthplace, and the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust to distribute grants across Britain and Ireland. The boy from Moody Street, Dunfermline, had returned, not as a weaver's son, but as the financier of a nation's public infrastructure. He died at Shadowbrook, his estate in Lenox, Massachusetts, on the 11th of August 1919. He is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, New York. The cottage in Dunfermline where he was born is preserved as a museum to this day.